Trench warfare, an infamous hallmark of World War I, defined a generation of soldiers and reshaped the course of modern warfare. But beyond the stereotypes, behind the mud and blood, lay a complex system that profoundly impacted the lives of millions. In this video, we'll delve deep into the history of trench warfare on the Western Front, examining the conditions, strategies, and the grim realities faced by soldiers from 1914 to 1918. Welcome to the harsh reality of life on the Western Front. The development of trench warfare was not an isolated occurrence, but a direct response to the technological innovations of the early 20th century. The machine gun, with its devastating power, and the rapid advances in artillery made open field warfare unfeasible. Instead, soldiers found themselves locked in static, entrenched positions that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, a continuous line of fortifications that defined the Western Front. Initially, trenches were not the massive, fortified complexes we think of today. In the early stages of the war, soldiers dug rudimentary defenses, just deep enough to shield them from rifle and artillery fire. But as the conflict dragged on, these trenches evolved into complex networks, complete with command posts, living quarters, and supply routes. Trenches on the Western Front were not a simple series of ditches. They were elaborate systems, often extending miles across the landscape. A typical trench system included 3 lines: the front line, the support line, and the reserve line, each serving distinct purposes. The front line was where soldiers experienced the most direct combat. Here, men would huddle in narrow, muddy ditches, constantly exposed to artillery bombardments and sniper fire. A few meters behind, the support line provided reinforcement and relief. And further back, the reserve line offered more extensive protection, but it was still far from safe. Trenches were often constructed in zigzag patterns to limit the damage from artillery and reduce the risk of enfilade fire where the enemy could target soldiers along the entire length of the trench. Life in the trenches was unimaginable for those who experienced it. The trenches were often knee-deep in mud, with rainwater, sewage, and blood pooling together. Soldiers lived in constant discomfort, enduring unsanitary conditions, diseases, and vermin infestations. Rats, lice, and flies were ubiquitous. The trenches themselves were breeding grounds for illnesses like trench foot, dysentery, and typhoid. But the physical conditions were just part of the nightmare. Psychological trauma was an ever-present reality. The constant threat of death, the deafening noise of artillery, and the sight of fallen comrades left soldiers with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). Many soldiers suffered from shell shock, an early term for what we now understand as psychological trauma, often leading to emotional breakdowns and severe anxiety. Trench warfare was a grueling test of strategy, but it was also a war of attrition. Generals on both sides employed brutal tactics, often involving massive artillery bombardments followed by infantry assaults over the open ground known as no man's land, but these tactics rarely achieved their intended results. The bombardments aimed to destroy enemy defenses and demoralize soldiers, but in practice they often left the enemy's trench systems relatively intact. When soldiers advanced, they were met with devastating machine gun fire. The result was catastrophic losses, with soldiers sometimes advancing only to be cut down in waves. The goal was not necessarily to win a decisive battle, but to gain a few hundred yards, often at an unspeakable cost. While trench warfare was characterized by static battles, technological advancements gradually began to shift the dynamic. The use of poison gas, first deployed by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, created a new horror. Gas attacks were indiscriminate, often blowing back on their own troops and causing agonizing deaths. Another significant innovation was the tank. Though initially crude and ineffective, the British Mark I tanks introduced in 1916 represented a breakthrough in the potential for breaking the stalemate of trench warfare. These heavily armored vehicles could cross trenches and barbed wire, though their reliability and speed were often lacking. In addition to these, the machine gun, artillery, and mortar continued to evolve, each side trying to outdo the other in terms of firepower, range, and effectiveness. The cost of trench warfare was immense, both in terms of lives and the psychological toll on the soldiers. An estimated 1.7 million soldiers died on the Western Front, with millions more wounded, many of whom would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The prolonged nature of the conflict created a deep sense of futility, with soldiers often asking themselves if their sacrifices were in vain. The war's toll wasn't confined to soldiers alone. The civilians living near the front lines also bore the brunt of the destruction, their villages reduced to rubble, their lives forever altered by the presence of the war machine. Trench warfare on the Western Front was a defining chapter in military history. It was a brutal and harrowing experience that shaped not only the outcome of World War I, but also the future of warfare itself. The soldiers who fought in the trenches were often forgotten in the history books, their experiences overshadowed by the grand strategies and the politicians who led them. But their suffering, their courage, and their endurance should never be forgotten. As we look back at the Western Front, let us remember the sacrifices of those who lived and died in the trenches and the lessons we can still learn from this most harrowing chapter in human history. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts or questions in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.